Sure, our system of free enterprise isn't perfect. But before we throw it away for some imported double talk, let's turn the clock back a few years to see what it's done for us. For example, back in the 1890s, Joe Dokes was just a guy who liked to tinker around his barn. Some people thought Joe was lazy. Some even thought he was nuts. But one day, he had an idea. And because he was free to dream his dream and tinker, Joe had a chance to make something of himself and his idea. So, of course, some people didn't think so much of Joe's idea, but that didn't stop him. So Joe got some money from young Aunt Minnie and Uncle Angus and Grandpappy and Mr. Titus. When Joe's friends and relatives used their savings to help him buy tools and property, they were capitalists. Don't blush, folks. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Now, naturally, Joe needed some help. So he hired Willie Lumpkin, who was out of work anyway, and before long, Willie had the know-how and became skilled labor. Because capital, management, and labor worked together, Joe's idea grew. It grew and did things even he never dreamed of. Today, the automobile industry provides millions of jobs that never existed before. And remember, this is a story of only one industry. There are thousands more scattered all over the United States whose history of development is pretty much the same. We've built a country under the American system that sends more young people to high school and college than all the rest of the world combined. Why, even in the Depression, our wages bought more food, clothing, travel, and entertainment than the wages of any other people in the world. Our country has a national income equal to the total national incomes of any other 6 nations in the world. With only 7% of the Earth's people, we drive 70% of the world's automobiles. That's just a sample of the things the capitalistic system has given us in only 160 years.
Okay, that is a political cartoon, obviously, for general consumption from 1948. So you can see it's got some pretty heavy post-World War II, early Cold War sympathies going on in there. I don't think they're hiding that very well, but I love it. I love the simplicity of how he describes capitalism and obviously the benefits that go with it. And we talked a little bit last time about how a capitalist system has a free government of some kind, whether it's democratic, a monarchy, a parliament, an oligarchy really, but it requires a certain amount of freedom on the part of consumers to be able to buy and sell and make these individual choices, whereas other types of economic systems require more government control just by definition. So we're going to talk today about some of those types of economic systems and the role they play with government, and I thought this was a good way to get us started and just thinking about how, first of all, we tend to think that our own system is the best. Whoever you are, whatever system you're in, tends to think that's ideal. But that doesn't mean that we can't still see the benefits in other systems, and it doesn't mean that there isn't room for some adaptation. So as we've talked about how economics is the study of choices. Okay. Hey, Katie, welcome. We've talked about how economics is the study of choices, and at the very beginning there was a little mention that there's this idea of macroeconomics and microeconomics, and macro is really what we are looking at when we're talking about the whole system. So that's kind of looking at how the government is related to it and what types of economic systems are using. Microeconomics focuses on specific choices or actions, so it might be specific choices that are made by a group or looking at specific groups. It doesn't follow one individual, but it can zoom in and kind of look at different types of areas. So we are looking definitely at macroeconomics right now. And it still plays that part with scarcity. Scarcity is still our key concept here. Understanding that people have to make choices because resources are limited. And that with that, it's choices of the goods and services they're going to be consuming, and then understanding kind of the relationship that everything plays in. So the rules haven't changed for economics, whether we're looking at how you are managing your budget or we're looking at how a government is providing services. It's still the same kind of factors involved in there. And we have our same 3 basic questions from the beginning. Who gets access to goods and services? How should goods and services be produced? And who's gonna be producing those? So same 3 questions. And if we think back to the beginning, remember we watched that Silly Schoolhouse Rock on barter video, and we see the startup of trading, and really the origin of economic systems comes from that first ideas of trade, of being able to produce something and then trading it for something you maybe can't produce as efficiently or aren't able to produce, or that would produce with a high opportunity cost. So if you're stuck on that desert island and you can do the fishing and someone else can do the firewood gathering, then you both can have cooked fish for dinner rather than having to do everything yourself. So a traditional economy is really just that first basic idea of trading, of you produce and trade and someone else produces and trades, and there's no regulation, there's really no currency, things are just bought and sold or traded as needed. Can you think, is there anywhere in the world today or any smaller markets where this kind of traditional economy still happens? Yeah. Yeah, there really aren't like any huge whole markets that are operated on this traditional economy, but there are instances for sure of trading goods directly for other goods. So trading in agriculture, it can happen. It can happen in private sales. If you're willing to do the dishes in exchange for someone else to vacuum, that's a kind of a traditional economy. Those really where there's no currency involved, there's no regulation, it's just trade. That's really what that traditional economy is. And then we see that develop on, and then we talked a little bit about it last week, but we'll hit it up again, this idea of a command economy. And it is theoretical because it can't exist in practice, it's too hard. So in a command economy, who would you guess answers these questions? Who gets access to goods and services? How should they be produced? And who decides how much should be produced in that command system? No worries, no worries. So in all 3 of the questions are answered by the government. So if we remember that it's that economic spectrum, and command is the far side of extreme where the government is control of everything. They decide who gets access to goods, how goods are produced, and then what goods are produced. They are answering all of the questions in this command economy. So then the other side of that spectrum is where we have a market economy. Who do you think would answer these 3 questions on the other end of that in the market side? Yeah, exactly. Over on the other side, everything's answered by the consumers and the producers. Who gets access to the goods is whoever can afford them. So price is set by the producer and the consumer, and whoever can afford it can buy it. So we're saying the market decides. How should goods and services be produced? Consumers and producers decide that too. by what they're willing to actually produce, what they sell as far as resources, what they sell as finished goods, what consumers buy tells them if it's acceptable. And the same thing on how much is produced. That's decided by producers and consumers. So when we're talking about economic systems, macroeconomic systems, we have kind of this spectrum. And on the one side, we have a command economy where the government decides everything. And then the far end opposite of that is this market economy where the producers and the consumers decide everything. And both of these are theoretical. They don't exist in real life because they're too extreme. You can't have producers and consumers deciding everything, because then there's no regulation, there's no protection. Consumers won't live in a society like that. They'll ask for some kind of help and they'll get it, because this would be anarchy over here. And over here, you can't have total government control over everything, because even in systems that try it, there always emerges some kind of black market, some kind of individual system, some kind of barter where people are making goods and services without government control. So it's like just too strict. So all economies, all nations operate on some kind of a mixed economy. They take a little from the market and a little from the command, and they have some kind of mixed in the middle. And of those mixed economies, we tend to group them into three categories: communism, socialism, and capitalism. But they all take a little bit from each other, and it's kind of this idea of the spectrum. They can be somewhere along the line, but they don't have to be exactly locked into one. So a country that has a lot of individual control, we would say, is capitalist. But then a country that maybe has some individual control but has a lot of business involvement, a lot of government regulation, would be along that socialist idea. And then lots of government control is going to fall more on the communist side. So remember, though, that it doesn't have to be a type of political system over here with capitalism to mean it's capitalist. We're really just looking at the economy and at how these decisions are made about what gets produced, who produces it, and who has access to it. So in a mixed economy, it's this combination of ideas and how these questions are answered. So communist, government mostly runs the economy. Socialist, government's very involved in businesses, but there's still private business, there's private property, there's opportunities to accumulate wealth. And then over at capitalism, producers and consumers are making lots of the decisions, but there's still government regulation, there's still currency, there's still taxes, there's still limits on what people can do, but wealth is going to be inherently part of it. Of these systems, which do you think is the oldest, historically speaking? Yeah. Perfect. Capitalism just kind of happened. It's kind of just exists, this idea that people are trading and buying and selling, and the king or the landlord or somebody sets a rule about what you can buy or sell in their town, or this is the currency to use here. It just kind of evolves on its own all over the world. All societies have some kind of evidence of it. But when we talk about like modern capitalism, there's a guy named Adam Smith who was writing in the 1800s, and he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations, which is really kind of the handbook for how capitalism can work if you're looking at a government. And he wrote that if governments will kind of ease off and let people buy and sell as they want, he introduces the idea of like laissez-faire, if you remember learning that from world or American history, that just let people buy and trade, but make sure that the government protects the people, that like the borders are secure and that there's law and order, then the economy will make money and the country will profit. And so he wrote about how if governments will just protect people, they'll make money for them, and that will make money for the government. And that was really kind of the foundation of this idea of capitalism, of don't get too involved, just let the people buy and sell and keep them safe, and it'll make you money. And about 150 years after that, Adam Smith, as you might guess from his name, is English, and he's writing in English. He's living in London. About 150-ish years after him, Karl Marx, who is German, is living in London, and he is seeing the effects of capitalism, which is poverty, as it turns out. Capitalism has these inherent wealth gaps. The people with access to the capital, remember that means the finished goods and services that can be used to create more, the means of production. That's why we call it capitalism, because it's using capital, these existing things. The people who have that continue to get rich. If you own a factory and your factory produces stuff that people buy, you, the owner, will get really, really wealthy. Your factory workers, not so much. They're not so much going to be getting wealthy, maybe a paycheck. And so Karl Marx is living in kind of like Dickensian London, and he's seeing all this poverty and all of this wealth gaps, and he's a philosopher. And so he writes a book that really puts out a philosophy of how you could deal with these wealth gaps. And that book is, drumroll, The Communist Manifesto. And his book, The Communist Manifesto, is then the idea and the foundation for the application of communism that we see in the 20th century, of kind of putting his ideas into work. And it's interesting because Marx wasn't really an economist, and he wasn't really writing a how-to manual. And in his own writings, he thought that eventually you wouldn't need government. That if you had a really strong government that controlled everything and made sure everyone got what they needed and everyone took what they needed and did their best, it would like perpetuate to the point that you wouldn't need a government anymore, because everyone would just be working really hard and getting what they need and taking care of their neighbors and having all things in common. Tell me, from what you know of world history, does that work out the way Marx said it would? We eventually need no governments because communism just continues to work together and everyone works their hardest and has everything that they need. Yeah, it not so much. It doesn't really work out as well as he thought it would, but then he's a philosopher. But part of it is because people don't have individual motivation in that kind of a system, and so they don't keep working hard. So if you were looking at a country and you were trying to decide if it was capitalist or communist, what kinds of things would you look for? How can you tell what type of economy a nation has? That could be one. That could be one. If there, I mean, what would it tell you? Like if there's a high unemployment rate, would that tell you that it's capitalist or communist? Okay, that makes sense. So it's like individual choice or opportunities. So they're making those decisions. That could be. That's a great marker to look for. So for like high level, if you're looking at a country, you can look at those same three questions we've been talking about. You can look at who is deciding what gets made and produced. So are there lots of regulations about what gets made? Remember you had that assignment where you had to look at like an agency that regulated the economy, the FDA or the EPA. So are there lots of agencies in a country that limit what people get to make and sell? And who decides how things get produced? So that's like who has access to the resources. So if the country has like does a lot of mining and exporting, does the government own the mining companies? Or are they owned by individual company? If the country exports a whole bunch of automobiles, does the government own the car company or are they owned by private companies? So that would tell you, is it a command economy? Is there lots of government control, or does it have more of a market system? Is it more capitalist? And looking at who has access to goods and services. So is there a lot of poverty and do people still get stuff? So is there like education? Do people only go to school who can afford it, or does the government provide free schooling? or transportation or healthcare? So you can look at those 3 questions, or you can zoom in a little bit closer and look at some of the indicators like you're saying. Look at unemployment, look at the poverty level, look at education. Are people going to school and how are they affording it? So looking at a government and trying to decide what kind of economy is tied to it, you really just want to look for those same 3 things. Who has access to the goods and services? Do only rich people afford the doctor's office, or is there something else that's offered to them? Because if only the wealthy can afford it, it's capitalist. But if the government's providing it to other people, well, then there's a lot of government involvement. So it's going to be more on the other side of the spectrum. Does that make sense? What you would look for? So it really is just those same 3 questions. Who has access to goods and services? Who decides what gets made? And how is it being done? So it's the same things that we kind of talked about last week with the US economy, but look at it at any government. Who's producing the goods and services? Are they owned by the government? Are they owned by private company? Is social welfare being provided? Is there housing or transportation? Is there public education? And then is the government helping the economy run smoothly? If they are not involved at all, extreme capitalism happening. If they are involved, how much are they involved? Those regulatory programs, are they actually enforcing the rules? Does the country have competition? Because those are 2 that can make you go either way. If the government's enforcing the rules and regulations, so it's moving away from capitalism, and if the government's enforcing competition, that's actually also moving away unless the government is the one that owns all of the companies, and then they're outlying competition. So not every factor takes it one way. So you really have to kind of think about, again, those 3 big questions. Who's producing stuff? Who has access to it? Because they're all the same ideas that we talked about before. Competition leads to innovation and new ideas and prices, lowers them down. The government should be providing services for people, ideally, and if they're not, then they're not involved. And so we'd look that it's, well, more of a capitalist nation. So there's a little bit of vocabulary with communism that I just want to make sure you know. Obviously, Karl Marx is considered the father. He's the author of the Communist Manifesto. He was writing as a way to get rid of these wealth gaps, to kind of deal with them. When he talks about the bourgeoisie, he's talking about the people that have access to capital, so the wealthy, the business owners. Then he uses the word proletariat to talk about the working class. Eventually thought communism would create this kind of utopian type system with no problems. Yeah, because his idea was that, because remember, he's living in with all of these wealth disparity and these social classes, and his idea was that we should get rid of them, that if there aren't any classes and everyone has access to everything equally, then everyone will be happy. So he put a lot of emphasis on getting rid of social classes. And one of the key indicators that there are classes is this wealth disparity. Some people own stuff and some people don't. So his solution was no one should own anything, and then everyone can own everything. If we all share everything and have it in common, you won't have any classes and you won't have any wealth gaps. Everyone will have what they need, which is a really, really nice theory. But when it comes to that kind of wealth distribution, the wealthy don't enjoy having everything they own taken away from them. And then poor people, they enjoy getting their things, but it didn't even out the classes as much as he thought it would, because there were still people that had to work and people who didn't, and it didn't really work out. But he did put a strong emphasis on social classes. When we talk about capitalism, obviously we talk about Adam Smith, who isn't the father of capitalism because it just kind of happens, but he is the father of modern economics because of his book, The Wealth of Nations. And in it, he talked about the invisible hand, this idea that if governments didn't get involved, that an economy would sort itself out on its own, and it would naturally find equilibrium, and it would naturally grow, and that you should let producers and consumers make the decisions. That a government's job is really just to protect the borders, to make sure that the country is safe and stable so that business can do its thing. And so those are really the 2 figureheads when we talk about individuals, is Marx and then Adam Smith. And then we have our spectrum here again. So I used to do an activity in my classroom to kind of simulate what this felt like. And so we're going to try and do it, but it might not work out because there's only the two of us. So we're going to start on the capitalism side. So in a capitalist system, a lot of it is luck. You can be born to a family that's wealthy. You can be born to a family that's not. You can be super smart or have scholarships. You can win the lottery. You can work really hard and make a savings. You can work really hard and have something go wrong and lose everything. So it's not very secure. So I have some candy that unfortunately I can't feed you through the camera, but this little pile is yours. You've got like 5. And I have 2 because I wasn't very lucky. So I'm going to let you work really hard and guess the number that I'm thinking of. And if you are closer to it, like within 4, then you will get all of my money. Okay? So between 1 and 10, guess the number. This is the equivalent of working hard. 7, you're good because my number was 8. So you get all my money. Congratulations. You now have 8 candy that you can't eat. Good job. And then we could do it again, and I could win some of the money back from you, and we could just go back and forth, or you could continue to get the wealth. And that's what happens in capitalism. There's no real rules, and you just get stuff if you work hard or are lucky, and you start out ahead or you don't. And I don't have any candy now, so that stinks for me. And you do have candy now, so good for you. And that's kind of how it goes. In the socialist system, remember we're talking the economic terms, it has the government seeking to kind of balance things out. That's why governments get involved. So they provide those services like schools and healthcare and housing and some regulation to try and even out the experience. So you can still get wealthy, but they also try and provide these services. So if we're now in our socialist system and you have, what do you have here? 8. So you're going to keep 4, and then 4 are going to be provided to me in the terms of goods and services. So my free housing and my health care, my transportation. So I've got 4 here now. But in a social system, you still get to work hard and you can still accumulate personal wealth. So again, guess the number I'm thinking of between 1 and 10. And if you're closest, then 5, you get it. 3. I think you figured out my system because my number was 4. So you will get 2 again. And I still have 2. And go ahead and guess the number again between 1 and 10. Okay, it was 9. You really got me figured out here. So now you get all of my wealth and I'm poor again. But because we're in a socialist system, some of yours is getting collected in taxes and given back to me. So I now have 4 again, and you have 4 again. That's how socialism feels like, okay? Now, in a communist system, as you pointed out, Marx wanted to get rid of classes and make sure everyone had what they needed. So in a communist system, there's no private property. So your candy and my candy are now our candy. And so ideally, between the two of us, we have 8. But as we see in the 20th century, when governments get enough control to maintain and have access to all of the resources of everyone, they tend to become corrupt and they eat the candy themselves, and it doesn't really work out. So for the communist one, you don't get any, and since I'm the government, I get 1. And that is what the social systems feels like. What do you think, Katie? Is that an accurate simulation? Okay, I have some vocab words here that we need to match up with their definitions. So I'm sorry that you don't have any candy. If I could send you some through the camera, I would. But I'm glad it makes more sense now. So really, it just comes down to like how much government control there is. And socialism on an economic term really is just trying to balance it out, to take the excess and give it to others in the forms of either goods and services or transfer payments. So things like Medicare and reduced reduce fees for things. So that's kind of how it works. On the little black like toolbar that you have for the Zoom room, you should have an option that says annotate. Do you have that? If you click on it, you should be able to pick the draw option and it'll give you like a pen, and then you can write on the screen and you can match up our terms. No, just like it's annotate with a pen. So on my side, it's next to remote control. No, you don't have that? Oh, bummer. I can't figure out, sometimes students have it, sometimes they don't. And on my side, it just shows that it's enabled for everyone. So, are you in full screen? Oh, you are now? Okay. Sometimes when you're in full screen, it won't give it to you. Okay, well then you can just boss me around and tell me what definition the word should go to. So we've got mixed economy, communism, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, democracy, socialism, I can't see my whole monitor, there we go, capitalism. So some government involvement, but individuals, businesses answer most questions leading to competition and profits. So which term do you think this definition best goes to? Yes. Well, I don't know, because maybe we better look at the other terms first. I actually don't remember. Yeah, no. Okay, let's do the next one. Just in case, I don't want to steer you astray. Wrote the Communist Manifesto, believed ideal economy without a government. Yeah, Karl Marx. Okay, good job. Lots of government regulations, but has privately owned businesses. Yes, that one's socialism. So lots of government regulations, and that can be high taxes, it could be limits on what's produced, it could be governments owning some of the resources, but then this privately owned businesses is what's important. And so a lot of times around the world, we see it as like democratic socialism. So it's the idea that there is this socialism, this kind of government involvement to even out the economy, but then there's still democracy, there's still private property. So thinking lots of Northern European countries have this kind of a system. So when socialism gets talked about in American politics, it's a little bit different than how we see it actually implemented in different places. So it's like how democracy and republic are types of government systems, but then in America we also have them as our two political parties, and the names don't always correlate to what they originated as. So for our purposes, this is socialism. Okay. All right, next one we've got wrote Wealth of Nations, believed country would do better without government involvement. Yeah, that's Adam Smith. All right, and then we have government answers all three questions. So what's produced, who produces it, who has access to it, has never been practiced the way its originator intended. Yeah, it's communism. Tries and tries, but they never quite make it to Karl Marx's plan. And then combines theoretical command and market to create a system with some level of government control and individual business growth. Oh. Yeah, I've got the terms here. So that would be what we've been talking about with all three of these as a mixed market. So it's taking those extremes of command and market and then putting them together in some combination. And so all government systems, all government and economic systems are some kind of a mixed economy now. They're taking a little bit from each side. So which means that our back to the red one at the top, some government involvement, but individuals, businesses answer most questions leading to competition and profits would be what? Yes, capitalism. You have got it. Perfect. Okay, that is it. That's pretty much it. That's what I wanted to cover for today. That's the setup for the next unit. You did great on Unit E, so that's the setup for Unit F. There is an assignment in that unit that can be awesome. I love it. And so it asks you to pick a country. It's the research paper. It's split out into 5 steps, but the first steps are really easy. So the assignment is that you pick a country. So you can pick any country except for the United States. Step 1, pick a country. Step 2, you want to decide what kind of economic system it has. So it's going to be a mixed market. So it's either going to be communism, socialism, or capitalism, and it can be somewhere in between. So your answer could be a mix of socialism and capitalism. So you pick a country, and then you decide what economic system it's going to be. For step 2, you tell me, and you might change your answer later. Step 3 is an outline of how you're going to support that. So you start doing some research and finding sources. And remember, you want to look at those things we talked about. So who produces stuff? Who has access to stuff? How is it paid for? So it's those 3 questions, and then focus it in a little bit more. Step 4 is a rough draft, and step 5 is the final paper. So that is the assignment for this unit, is to pick a country and break it down and figure out what kind of economy they have. Do you have questions on that right now?